and I want to welcome everyone to our community Yom Hashoah program on the evening when we mark the close of this annual day of commemoration. This year we had planned on a program bringing our congregations physically together and preserving the tradition of a broad-based community event involving all generations and 9 congregations. However, it became clear around a month ago that such an event would be impossible this year at a time of social separation. As a result, tonight we are going to do an abridged version of a ritual of memory, loss, and hope, and hear from our speaker, Professor Laurel Leff of Northeastern University, address us about her recent book, Well Worth Saving: American University's Life and Death Decisions on Refugees from Nazi Europe. I am Rabbi Leonard Gordon of Congregation B'nai Tikvah in Canton, and I want to welcome the other congregations who are joining us tonight. Ahavat Torah from Stoughton, Temple Chaye Shalom in Easton, Temple Sinai in Sharon, Temple Adath Sharon, Temple Beth David in Canton, Temple Israel in Sharon, Young Israel of Sharon, and Temple Beth Emunah in Easton. And we also thank for arranging the speaker series of which Professor Leff's talk is a part. Tonight's program is on Zoom and is being broadcast through a YouTube channel on the B'nai Tikvah website. We have muted everyone on the Zoom who is not participating in the service, and we ask everyone to be careful to remain muted throughout the program. If you have a comment or a question for the speaker, please use the chat function and I will relate the questions or respond privately as appropriate. And to everyone, thank you and welcome. We're going to begin our program this evening with the lighting of 6 yahrzeit candles being lit by my wife, Lori, a 2nd-generation child of survivors, and our daughter, Samara, part of the 3rd generation. Tonight is the yahrzeit for Lori's survivor grandfather, Shmuel Weinstein, for whom our daughter is named. The lighting of the candles now. To learn more about our 6 million sisters and brothers as individuals and as part of communities, to recall their memory throughout the year so that they will not suffer a second death. May we recall not only the terror of their deaths, but also the splendor of their daily lives. I want to turn now to Cantor Joshua Grossman for the memorial prayer in honor of the 6 million martyrs of our people, and those who can are encouraged to please rise.
Yizkor Elohim et nishmot kol acheinu b'nei Yisrael שמסרו נפשם על קידוש השם, את אנשים, נשים וטף, שנחנקו ושנשרפו ושנחרגו בשואה, בעבור שאנו מתפללים בעד הזכרת נשמתם. אנא ישמע בחיינו את גבורתם ומסירותם, ויראה במעשינו טוהר ליבם, ותהיינה נפשותיהם צרורות בצרור החיים, ותהי מנוחתם כבוד. שובע שמחות את פניך, נעימות במימינך, נצח. Amen.
May God remember the souls of the martyrs of our people who gave their lives for the sanctification of God's name, and the men, women, and children who were slaughtered, burned, and killed in the Shoah. In their memory, we pray. May our lives reflect a measure of their bravery, dedication, and purity of soul. May their souls be bound up in the bonds of life eternal. May they be remembered with honor, and may they now rest in peace at your right hand forever. And let us say, Amen. Please be seated, everyone. I am honored now to introduce tonight's speaker at University. She has written extensively about America and the Holocaust, including her 2005 book, Buried by the Times, The Holocaust in America's Most Important Newspaper, and her recent book, Well Worth Saving, American Universities' Life and Death Decisions on Refugees from Nazi Europe. She has a bachelor's degree from Princeton, master's degree in law from Yale, and communications from the University of Miami. She has been a reporter as well as a student of journalism for the Wall Street Journal and the Miami Herald. And I remind those on Zoom or YouTube that you can send questions for the speaker through the chat function, and I will then convey those questions to the speaker after her presentation. So I turn the mic now over to Laurel Leff.
Hi, I'm going to apologize ahead of time for the technical difficulties, which there are bound to be. I hope you can hear me. I can't promise that you can, but I will do my best. I'm so glad to be with all of you tonight in whatever way we can. As we lose track of what day of the week it is, what month it is, it's important to be pulled back to other mark of our lives. We did that 2 weeks ago with Pesach, and I'm glad we're doing it tonight with Yom HaShoah. Both holidays command us to remember. With Yom HaShoah, there is a historical obligation to do that accompanies the religious and moral imperative. So remember today, and we mark this day together. Thank you to Rabbi Gordon and my Northeastern colleague, the wonderful Lori Lefkowitz, the entire Tikvah congregation for allowing me to step outside my very small universe at the moment and think about where we stand in history. As some of you know, and as Rabbi Gordon mentioned, I recently wrote a book, Well Worth Saving, American Universities' Life and Death Decisions on Refugees from Nazi Europe. The book begins in 1933 with the firing of the first German for being Jewish or non-Aryan or politically suspect, and takes the reader through the response of American universities to this crisis. And tonight, rather than giving you the entirety of the book, I'm going to focus on a particular time period in this drama, because it illustrates two different lessons on how individuals and institutions react to world-shattering crises. The period is 1940, 1941, after the Germans have seized Holland, Denmark, Norway, Luxembourg, and Belgium, and culminates in the fall of France. What had been a refugee crisis became a catastrophe. And it was, of course, a catastrophe for the whole world, but it was also a catastrophe for the women and men trying to save European scholars. Not only were there thousands added to those seeking help from newly Nazified countries, but many scholars from all over Europe had been taking refuge in France. So this really was a catastrophe for them. As I do in the book, I'm going to tell you what happened to individual scholars that were caught up in the maelstrom. In this case, the scholar is Michel Gorlin. He was a young man who specialized in Russian literature. But before we get to that, we're going to just take a step back and do a little bit of the background and the history. So that will bring us up to the crisis in 40 and 41. Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933. Within 3 months, the law for the restoration of the civil service acted that barred all Jews or non-Aryans from working in any capacity for the German government, because all German universities state-run, and thousands of professors were dismissed by the end of the first year of the Nazi regime. In May 1933, a group was for New York City, the Emergency Committee in Aid of Displaced German Scholars. It then became the Emergency Committee in Aid of Displaced Foreign Scholars, but at first it was just for German scholars. And the idea was to find displaced scholars a home in US universities. To encourage universities to hire foreign scholars in the midst of the Great Depression, the committee arranged to pay the professor's salary for the first 2 years. The committee paid half the salary, and other organizations, and then ultimately it was mostly the Rockefeller Foundation, paid the rest. And professors had an advantage under the immigration laws. Section 4D of the Immigration Act of 1924 it made anyone who had been carrying on the vocation of professor for 2 years prior to immigrating and planned to continue that vocation in the United States was eligible for a non-quota visa. Aside for domestics, this was the only part of the immigration law that cared about anything having to do with your profession. So actually for professors and also for clergy. That meant that people who qualified for a non-quota visa were not subject to the annual limitation on immigration to the United States, which was 159,000 a year, or the country by country quotas, which for Germany was 25,957. Now the State Department interpreted the statute, and the way that it interpreted it was to say that you were going to carry on the vocation of professor in the United States, you need to have an offer to teach at an American university, an American institution of learning. So getting a university to extend an offer was absolutely critical. Thousands more scholars sought university jobs than received them. As one measure, the Emergency Committee, which was in fact the primary American committee to help rescue European scholars, received over 6,000 appeals and ended up placing just 335 scholars. In late 1930s, it had 1,000 refugee scholars looking for the 10 jobs that are likely to turn up. Now, universities decided who among these thousands of scholars who were looking for jobs was that they would do any other hiring decision, at least initially. That meant that just like any other hiring decision, they did it on an individualized basis. They didn't say, for 10 refugee scholars, they looked at each individual scholar, they looked at their curriculum vitae. This would be done by a particular department. So if mathematician, the math department would look at the particular scholar's credentials in terms of teaching, publication, and service, as well as that university and that department's own needs. And if this sounds familiar to people who are academics now, it was a very similar process. This was first and a hiring decision. The university administration would weigh in, and then an offer would be made or not. It was a slow, laborious process, and it added fewer than 100 or so refugee scholars a year to the halls of American academia. Now, the problem then grew worse. So if you first look at the period from 1933 to 1938, but in March of 1938, Germany annexed Austria, and a year later, Czechoslovakia was added to the Reich, and both of those newly parts of the Reich imposed the same anti-Semitic laws that had been prevalent in place in Germany, including the one that barred Jews and non-Aryans from Austrian and Czech universities. A year later, so in 1940, the Germans blitzed through most of Western Europe and bombed major British cities. When France fell in June of 1940, it felt to many that Western civilization was at an end. This was particularly true of the American organizations trying to help refugee scholars. One Rockefeller Foundation official wrote, "Night appears to be settling down on the people who have given the fun meaning to the word culture." The foundation's obligation was clear: to preserve the best of the scientists and scholars of France for civilization. So as bombs fell on Paris and the last British troops escaped Dunkirk, the Rockefeller Foundation prepared a "if Hitler wins" memo. That's what they called it. The June 3rd, 1940 memo assumed that Germany would control all of Europe, including Great Britain. And the foundation then advocated hiring in the Americas the best minds from Great Britain, 75 from France, and smaller numbers from other countries. The memo suggested assembling the list of men and women who we would most like to see here, so the foundation would be ready if the final tragedy occurs. The foundation and other organizations helping refugee scholars were ready. And I think this brings us to the first lesson that we can apply to our times, which is that the refugee organizations demonstrated a willingness to face reality, to assess the prospects realistically, to pivot quickly, and to do things differently than they had done before. And this was all done within basically the month of June. So as Europe crumbled around them, top Rockefeller officials signed off on a plan to save the continent's scholars and to bend their rules to do it. They knew that they had no time for the usual procedure of waiting for the universities to make offers and then deciding separately whether to fund them. Instead, both the Rockefeller Foundation and the Emergency Committee decided to work instead through Alvin Johnson and the New School for Social Research, who, as one rescue advocate put it, are relatively free, aggressive, and ingenious. And let me just tell you a little bit about the New School, or at least this particular role. In 1934, the New School, which already existed as an undergraduate institution in Lower Manhattan, decided to add a graduate program. And the graduate program's faculty was consist entirely of refugee scholars. And the faculty selection process was very simple. The president of the New School, Alvin Johnson, chose whomever he wanted to be on the faculty. So it happened very quickly and very easily. As he wrote in his memoirs, "I put the case of a scholar just one lap ahead of Hitler's hound. What would the emergency committee be able to do for him? Recommend him to a college where he would have to be approved by department, dean, college presidents, perhaps a committee of the board? In the meantime, Hitler's hounds would have got him. My institution could make up its mind in an hour and send off a cable carrying the privilege of a non-quota immigration visa for the professor, his wife, and minor children." So the idea in France was to find positions for 100 scholars. And most of the scholars were in France, some were in Poland, the Netherlands, Austria, Belgium, and Czechoslovakia. And the New School agreed to hire many of them and assumed responsibility for all of the details, including negotiating with foreign governments and the State Department. The Rockefeller Foundation agreed to provide $400,000 for salaries, $1,000 for transportation. And just interestingly, look at how close those figures were. That was how expensive it was to get someone from France to the United States at that point. And $65,000 to the New School for administrative costs. The Rockefeller Foundation had a man who was already in France. His name was Alexander McKinsky. He was kind of a swashbuckling kind of guy. As soon as the Germans came into Paris, he moved to Lisbon, and from there he helped individual refugees book passages, get visas, do all the things that was necessary to get people out of the continent. And then the emergency committee, kind of not necessarily happily, but still agreed to take more of a backseat role and provide contacts and funds. But this was really mostly a new school in the Rockefeller Foundation operation. And this change made all the difference to some scholars. The Rockefeller Foundation was now considering scholars it never would have before, and one of them was Michel Gorlin. Let me tell you a little bit about Gorlin. He was a scholar working at the Slavic Institute in Paris. He had been born in St. Petersburg in 1909 and received a PhD in Slavic studies from the University of. In 1933, he fled Berlin to Paris, later joined by his partner Reza Bloch, who was a poet, and she herself had a PhD in medieval history. They married in 1935 and had a daughter, Dora, the next year. Once the war began in 1939, and understood that he was particularly endangered. He was not a French citizen, so he considered immigrating to Brussels or to the United States. Nothing worked out. At first, the Rockefeller Foundation was not the least interested in Michel Gorlin. He was a young scholar without a world-class reputation. So they weren't considering him. On May 14th, 1941, Paris police grabbed the 32-year-old Gorlin along with 5,000 other Jewish men between the ages of 18 and 40 in the first wave of mass arrests in France. Gorlin was sent to the internment camp Pithiviers, about 80 kilometers from Paris. Now, at that point, the Slavic Institute, where Gorlin had worked as a librarian, activated the Slavic scholarly community, both in France and abroad. Scholars from Harvard and the Library of Congress began bombarding the Rockefeller Foundation with letters attesting to the high quality of Gorlin's talents. Václav Lidnicki, who is a Harvard lecturer, wrote, "I believe that he, Gorlin, fully merits being saved from the concentration camp in which, if he remains, he will probably die, as his health is too frail to stand the strain." Gorlin, whose health was indeed poor, survived that summer 1941, enduring forced labor and the camp's meager rations. In August 1941, his fortunes seemed to change. The campaign of the Slavic scholarly community had worked. The New School for Social Research agreed to appoint him professor of comparative Slavonic literature with a $6,000 grant from the Rockefeller Foundation. The 2-year grant covered $25,000 a year in salary, which would be about $50,000 in contemporary years, and $1,000 in transportation costs. Gorlin's academic community seemed to have saved his life. So that's one lesson that we can apply to our times. In the midst of a crisis, individuals and organizations were willing to change procedures and even lower, in some senses, their standards for humanitarian reasons, in this case, to save a life. So that's the positive lesson from the catastrophe that befell the world in 1940 and 1941. But there's also a far more negative lesson from the same period. Institutions can use fear created by crises based on something or nothing to accomplish their own agendas. Since 1933, the State Department officials had been interpreting the language of the 4D non-quota to limit the type of institutions and the type of scholars who qualified and were allowed into the United States. So they had already been provisions to try and limit the number of people who could come even under the non-quota provision. Different consuls in different cities use different rationales, yet they always still relied on the provisions wording about if you were carrying on the vocation of professor for 2 years prior to immigrating and plan to continue to teach, be a professor in the United States. That was sort of all that the provision said. But at the outset of the European war, State Department officials took it upon themselves to reject non-quota visa applicants on grounds that were nowhere in the statutory language. They began examining the political backgrounds of those applying for non-quota visas and rejecting whomever did not meet their, meaning the State Department, standards. After the fall of France, the emergency committee ran into so many problems getting the grantees visas that Columbia professor Lee Dunn, who was very involved with the committee, he was a zoology professor, contacted the State Department Assistant Secretary Adolph Burl. Burl was an important FDR advisor with whom Dunn thought he had an in. He thought that they had a good relationship, but Dunn found Burl, and this Dunn describing Burl's attitude, frigid about political prisoners in France because, according to Burl, some of them might be communists, and since we already had enough aliens to shadow. So Dunn described his meeting with Burl to his emergency committee member, Alfred Cohen, who was one of the founders of the committee. He was a professor of cardiology at Rockefeller University. And he also knew Assistant Secretary Burl. So Cohen then wrote Burl to express his, and this is Cohen's words, his great distress that, again in Cohen's words, scholars, scientists, patriots of greatest human value in themselves and all probability capable of great contributions to our country should be excluded on no very good grounds or no grounds deemed reasonable by good citizens. Now, Cohen obviously struggled with whether he should write Burl at all, finally concluding, and this is what he wrote, "It is a desperate situation. All the more ought profound and sympathetic human feeling be applied to it." I can't say that that was the way that Burl responded. He responded with the argument that would be used repeatedly during the war years to restrict immigration. What he said was, and I'm quoting him, "A considerable amount of espionage work has been done under the guise of refugees," and he put refugees in single quotes, "including those relatives in Germany who could be coerced into spying," which was basically almost all of the Jewish refugees had relatives that were in what was now Reich territory. Fears of refugee espionage were a complete red herring. Of the 23,000 enemy aliens, that was how they were classified, who arrived in 1940 from German and Soviet territory, and you needed at this point to include Soviet territory because of course there was a pact between Germany and the Soviet Union. But if you look at all 23,000 of those aliens, only fewer than 1/2% were taken into custody for questioning, and only a fraction of those were indicted, and then for violating immigration regulations, not espionage. Refugee espionage, however, was an effective fear tactic nonetheless. In June 1941, the US Congress enacted a law that explicitly gave State Department authority to deny visas to any alien who might endanger public safety. And what that meant was completely up to the consuls in whichever city they were applying for a quota from, including those who had relatives remaining in German territory. On its own, the State Department, and then this was not anywhere in the language of the statute that allowed them to look at who might endanger public safety, erected new bureaucratic procedures for both quota and non-quota visa applicants that assured the immigration process would be dauntingly complex and exceedingly slow. And I should say, as we'll soon see, this is the point at which Germany has begun deportations of people from Austria, from Czechoslovakia to Poland, to the ghettos in Poland. So the idea of a slow process basically meant a process where someone would probably not live and not be able to come in. And the people in the State Department knew this. So even with the New School furiously making offers to scholars and the Rockefeller Foundation agreeing to fund them, most of the scholars could not enter the United States. In October 1941, 25 scholars had American positions waiting for them, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, but only about 6 had a fair chance of getting in because of the State Department roadblocks. The attack on Pearl Harbor 7 weeks later made the State Department even more determined to keep people out. The Rockefeller Foundation's McKinsey, who had left Lisbon and was now in Washington trying to get these people non-quota visas, recorded, the State Department is not anxious, apparently, to bring over many new aliens and was primarily admitting scholars who were considered useful to the national defense effort. On Saturday, January 24th, 1942, McKinsey was summoned to the department to explain to him the results of the foundation's visa request for 10 potential grantees. The chief of the State Department's visa division told McKinsey that 6 were being held up and had not yet been denied, and 4 had been denied visas because they could not contribute to the war effort. That was the State Department's language. One of them was Michel Gorlin. As his potential appeals languished in the State Department in the spring of 1942, and he suffered in Pithiviers, Gorlin's younger sister, Leila, who had immigrated to the United States, pestered the New School and the Rockefeller Foundation. She wrote, "Things in France being as they are, I am terribly afraid that if help will not come soon, it might be too late." And she wrote this specifically to Foundation official John Marshall in April 1942. "I should appreciate it very much if you would see your way to grant me an interview." Marshall at that point did not see the reason. He wrote, "I should be glad to talk his situation over with you if I thought there was anything further that I could do. But I have talked it over with Mr. McKinsey and am convinced that everything has been done that is possible at present." And this was about getting a visa from the State Department. "I'm afraid for the present, there is nothing but to wait and hope." So ultimately, the Rockefeller Foundation brought over only 52 of the 100 or so scholars they had identified as worthy of a US university position. 20 of them were teaching at the New School. About half the scholars offered New School posts, received non-quota visas, a better than average rate, most likely due to the Rockefeller Foundation's influence, but you can see it wasn't very much of a rate at all. Between Pearl Harbor and the war's end, the quotas from Axis control countries only 10% filled, quotas to the United States, with just 21,000 refugees, or about 500 a month, entering the United States from Nazi Europe. And so what happened to Michel Gorlin? Denied a non-quota visa in early January, and with no appeal proceeding in sight, Gorlin struggled in the Pithiviers camp. On March 27, 1942, the first convoy of French Jews left Drancy outside Paris for Auschwitz with 1,112 people. 4 more convoys of 4,037 people left for the same destination over the next 4 months. On the evening of July 16, 1942, Gorlin and almost 1,000 other Pithiviers prisoners were shoved into cars, 70 to 80 to a car. There was no food or water. It was very hot. The following morning at 6:15, convoy number 6 left Pithiviers for the 3-day trip to Auschwitz with 809 men and 119 women on board. Upon arrival at Auschwitz, all the deportees were selected for slave labor. Gorlin was assigned to transport heavy material, loading coal, and digging on construction sites. He did not last long. Gorlin died on September 5th, 1942 at 9:10 p.m. at the age of 33. That same month, the New School succeeded in getting the State Department to grant Gorlin a non-quota visa, and the consul in Lyon was advised to issue it. At that point, however, the New School was not able to reach Gorlin. He had been dead for a month. Thank you. And I'm very eager and anxious to take your questions.
Thank you, Laurel. Thank you for that presentation. Laurel, if anybody wants to add a question, please do put it through on chat. But Laurel, if I could ask you to reflect a little bit on the motivations of the people in the State Department, and also how public was this issue of immigration quotas in America? Is this something that was being written about in the Times? Were there organizations that were advocating one way or the other outside of the foundations and a place like the New School? I'm trying to get a sense of a comparison and contrast with our own moment.
Right, so I'm going to start with the second question first, because I think it's maybe better to sort of understand the lay of the land, and then we can look particularly at the State Department and its motivations. The Times wrote occasionally about this. I mean, throughout this period, there were fights about immigration and about quotas, and most scholars have focused on the fact that there was a push to lower the quotas even more than they already were. But the reality is it sort of went in both directions. The head of the Immigration Committee at the time was a man named Samuel Dickstein. He was a congressman from Brooklyn. He obviously had a number of Jews and immigrants among his constituency. So he actually succeeded, and there was never a vote in the Congress on lowering quotas, and this was partly because of his efforts. And certainly the Times wrote about that. I think where you see most of the reporting on the immigration issue was in liberal publications. So The Nation wrote about this repeatedly. The New Republic wrote about this repeatedly. PM Magazine in 1940 did a big expose of the State Department and their attitude towards immigrants. Interestingly, the reporter on it was a man named I.F. Stone, who then, Izzy Stone, became a very famous pioneering journalist in his later period. So it's a story that was known and told, but not a lot of attention was focused on it except by liberal publications. The mainstream press, while it reported on it, did not sort of take it up. And the liberal press really did. The New Republic, The Nation, PM, which was an afternoon newspaper in New York, really did make it something that they pushed. As for the question of the State Department and its motivations, at this point, the State Department was very much dominated almost exclusively by the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite. I mean, that was considered one of the occupations that if you were from a wealthy West family, going into the State Department, becoming a foreign service officer was considered something that was very prestigious. And so the department was either dominated by people from this kind of background, from elite schools, both elite prep schools and elite universities, or maybe some middle-class people who were WASP wannabes, who might have been even more determined to keep foreigners, and particularly South and East European foreigners from coming into the United States. So I think if you look at this record, some people have tried to separate the anti-foreign sentiment from the anti-Semitic sentiment. I don't think it makes sense really to do that. I think it's the same motivation. These people were not like the people in the State Department. They didn't have much sympathy for them. And probably most important, within the United States context, were very threatened by the encroachments that aspiring middle class and even lower class Jewish were having, that they were demanding and getting into the elite institutions. They were saying that they wanted to go to medical school and practice at the big hospitals. They wanted to be members of the top banking firms, and the WASP elite was sort of holding the line, but it was very much perceived as holding the line. So the idea of then allowing in more Jews, more refugees, many of whom were doctors or lawyers or professors, I think was not something they were very inclined to do. So my sense, and there are some other reasons. I mean, some people have said that they actually believed that these people were threatening to the United States. I think if you look at what was the basis in the State Department for these decisions to consider the refugees to be spies, there's almost no evidence for it. It is rumors. It is, frankly, silly. So the genuineness, I mean, it played, right? It worked very well in terms of the public and the public's fears, but in terms of internally of thinking that even a small segment of the Jews that were coming from Germany would be spies for the Reich, I think is not really justified.
Thank you. A question was raised about your title, Well Worth Saving. Is that a quote from somewhere?
Yes, it's actually a quote from Horst Callen. And actually it was used repeatedly, but I think of that because Callen himself was a professor. He was at the New School. He was a great liberal, but that was the way that the universities thought about it. And so partly what I'm documenting in this 40-41 period was a little bit of a change from that. Not a lot, because they still felt like we have to save the best. But when confronted with someone like Gorlin, who did have supporters in a concentration camp, they were willing to change their standards somewhat. But the basic attitude was, who were the people we're saving? And that was said repeatedly.
Got it. I have a question from a Tufts alum. If you have any anecdotes about Tufts and all of this, and in particular about the question of why were university presidents part of that protectionist, perspective during these years? And were there, what was that about in terms of university leadership? And again, anything anecdotal about Tufts in particular?
Okay, so I can say something a little bit about Tufts. I hadn't, almost every university that was in existence at this time has some sort of record like this. So I wasn't able to document what happened at every single university. I mean, one of the emergency committee did a little bit of my work for me, because in 1939, they sent around a former New York Times reporter to go to 75 different universities and assess what their attitudes were toward Jews. Tufts was not on one of the best lists, but it also was not on one of the worst lists. But I was also, and I do want to tell this story, is after Well Worth Saving came out, I heard from a retired Tufts professor at the medical school. And apparently there were about 10 refugee scholars at the medical school. And the Tufts Medical School at that time made and that's a large number. So at least in terms of the medical school, at Tufts were very good on the issue. As for the universities, I think there are two things. I mean, one is most universities presidents at this time, certainly of the elite institutions, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Princeton, were part of the same WASP social class. I mean, that's who they were as well. And they had very much the same feelings about trying to limit the number of Jews who were part of their student bodies and part of their faculties. I mean, I think it wasn't until the post-war period that in the undergraduate college at Yale did they have a single Jewish professor. There was few in the medical school and few in the law school, but not as undergraduate professors. At Harvard, it was the same thing. There were a few, but not very many, and this was very deliberate. Many universities had and departments had what they called the one Jew rule, which meant it was okay to hire one Jew, but then if you hired more, and then this is where the anti-Semitic stereotypes take over, then what happens is you hire one, they're very clannish, then they'll bring somebody else in. Before you know it, the whole place is going to be run by Jews. That was very much the fear. I mean, that's spread throughout society. I mean, it was at the universities, but it was also what allowed FDR, when he was looking at the situation in North Africa, and in North Africa, and the British and American troops took control of North Africa from the Vichy government, and they wanted to get rid of Vichy restrictions on Jews and professions. And FDR's attitude was, you know, they tend to dominate medicine and law and the professorate anyway, holding, you know, 60 or 70% of those positions. So it's understandable that people would want to restrict their numbers. You know, Isaiah Bowman, who was president of Johns Hopkins, and was a geographer, he had about how you had to spread the Jews out the United States or throughout different countries so they wouldn't get to be too powerful unit. So this was just very dominant in culture, in an upper class, particularly culture at that time. And upper class culture was what ran most of the powerful institutions in the United States.
Laurel, I want to ask one final question, and then we'll wrap up with a song together. Laurel, a question was raised about Brandeis and whether this experience of the universities not welcoming refugee scholars was part of the energy behind the creation of Brandeis, and the extent to which Brandeis then took some of these people in. Of course, Brandeis was founded, I think, in 48, was it? Or, you know, after the war. But is there some connection between the story of Brandeis and the story you're telling?
Yes, I think so. And on both counts, both in a sense of needing an institution that was not necessarily part of these elite institutions, and so that was somewhat of the impetus for Brandeis, and also in the sense of taking many of the refugee scholars. Probably among the more famous was Herbert Marcuse, who taught at Brandeis in the later period. And he was one of the refugee scholars who would work through the emergency committee. Although people didn't think very highly of him, I'm not sure, at least at that point, how he got the job.
Thank you so much.
But they didn't think very highly of Jean-Paul Sartre either, as just to mention it. You know, one of the problems was if they did either in a language or in a discipline or in a style like Sartre that wasn't familiar to American scholars, then that also meant you were very unlikely to get a job because they didn't know how to evaluate you, and you needed that sort of scholarly evaluation to get a position.
Got it. Laurel, thank you again. I'm going to unpin you now. Okay, I think I did that. I want to show, hold on one second. I want to share my screen and show a picture of the book for those of you who might be interested. Laurel, can you just say a quick word, if you would, about the photograph in the book, on the book cover?
Okay, yes, I was actually just thinking, oh, did I unmuted myself, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, so that's a picture of SA officials, which was another branch of Nazis, at the University of Vienna right after the Anschluss, and they're keeping the Jewish professors from entering the University of Vienna. So that's in 1938, in April of 1938.
Thank you so much. I am going to, Laurel, thank you again for joining us tonight and for that talk, which again, there's so much to say about our own moment. Literally, we are in a time when our country is openly debating again a moratorium on immigration, where there's a whole conversation about openness, about immigrants, about anxiety about immigrants. So much of the language has been continued and carried forward. So again, I want to thank you for getting this book out into the world at a moment when hopefully it can really have the kind of influence that we hope emerges from our commemoration of the Shoah and keeping the memory of these years alive. I want to screen share now to share the song Anima Amin, and ask Cantor Grossman to lead us in the singing of this anthem of hopefulness I believe with perfect faith that even in dark times, even in times when it appears that night is descending, that a happy future will emerge. And though that future seems delayed, every day we hope for its coming. Ani ma'amin.
אני מאמין באמונה שלמה בביאת המשיח. אני מאמין, אני מאמין באמונה שלמה בביאת המשיח. אני מאמין, ואף על פי שיתממע עם כל זה, אחכה לו עם כל זה, אחכה לו בכל יום שיבוא. אני מאמין באמונה שלמה בביאת המשיח. אני מאמין, ואף על פי שיתממע עם כל זה, אחכה לו, אחכה לו, אחכה לו בכל יום שיבוא.
Thank you, Cantor. Thank you, Professor Leff. Thank you all for joining us. And I just want to end with the blessing that as our 9 congregations have come together tonight in commemoration, may we find many opportunities in the months and years ahead to join together in both commemoration and sadness, as well as in joy and celebration. Good night, everyone.